All right, we're getting close to the end of the class here. We have our last quiz on Friday, so this lecture will match up with that. We've just got to do the middle of chapter 5, which happens to basically consist of the biggest event in American history, perhaps other than the American Revolutionary War. Those are the two things that characterize the culture that is going to develop into the present one that you know, that everybody knows so well. Is the America we know that everybody calls, blue states and red states, Republicans versus Democrats, and rich versus poor. All these kind of things. Is America a developed country? Obviously. But some aspects of the culture and society are underdeveloped. You only have to go to certain states and see the difference between, what can I use as an example? Las Vegas, Los Angeles, New York, cities I've been to. I haven't been to New York, but Miami, I've been to Miami when I was younger. You just look at these flashy places that have these expensive buildings, these huge, these crazy technologies. Vegas I've never been to either. You just watch a video of the Las Vegas Strip though and see what they've done. It's not a place you're supposed to live. It's too hot, it's too dry, and they create this amusement park, gambling, concert, entertainment venue in the middle of the desert, out of nothing, and there's places elsewhere in the world that have done that now too. Like I haven't been there either, but Dubai and Abu Dhabi spring to mind, and Qatar, Doha. They're not supposed to be there. They're created out of the excess wealth. But then you go to what they call there's have states and have not states. So you got California and New York on one hand, and then you have Kentucky and West Virginia. I don't have anything against these states. I've driven through them, but there's not a whole lot of stuff to see in either of them, and they're very poor. They're at the bottom of the 50 states, and the contrast is very obvious. There's some very poor towns full of unemployed people, and some of them are abandoned, half abandoned. There's people living there, but shops are closed down and buildings are falling apart. It looks like a totally different country. So you've got it's a huge country. We've talked about this already. One of the slides I showed was immense geography, just the variety, diversity, scale of the United States. Although Canada and Russia are bigger and China's the same size, the United States is unmatched in its geographical diversity, just because they've got these far-flung islands like Guam and Hawaii, and then Alaska and Florida on the other side, with such distances between them, and they still manage to make it work. Those contradictions aren't breaking points. Like I said to you last class though, America is the United States of America, and that's a good name because they've remained united on the most important points, I suppose, except during the Civil War. So let's talk about the 19th century and let's finish this up. Basically, you can divide the 19th century for America. It's easily divided in half by the Civil War, which happens in the 1860s. So it didn't land perfectly on the halfway mark. But for our purposes, there's a period called the antebellum period, which is the 60 years before, and then the postbellum period, which is the roughly 35 years that come after. And centuries are just numbers that we created anyway. So we're just talking about basically a 100-year period. You can just go from the Revolutionary War to the Civil War, and then to World War I until actually United States entry to World War One, and you've got really a neat, you know, three-war picture of how America developed in its first 150 years, right? The biggest legacy of the pre-war period are the slave states, and I said that's the biggest contradiction, and you're not allowed to use that as your example for your assignment, okay? So when the assignment goes up today, when I post this video, and I post the assignment, which is due on Saturday, the day after the quiz, you cannot use slavery as a contradiction. I already said that was the biggest contradiction. They tried to resolve it, but George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, being the most notable of the first few presidents who came from Virginia and were slave owners themselves, sort of made the point unresolvable, right? If they were going to have slaves, then they were going to permit it in the Union. So the 13 colonies turned into 13 states, and slavery existed, but they knew that what Thomas Jefferson had written was personally and socially and culturally unacceptable to the society that he was applying it to. The southern states rejected the fundamental principle that all men are created equal. And I mean, this is men in the old sense, I think, so it means people, really. It means women and people of all backgrounds, all classes, all races. It doesn't matter where you came from, where you were born, but especially if you're born in America, that you have the inherent right to be treated the same as everybody else, under the law, under God, because some people were religious. But surprisingly, in the beginning, the United States, when the founding fathers themselves were not super religious. Lots of people were before and afterwards. But we can't get into it. We've done enough religious background stuff to know that religious freedom is a principle of American society. But some people are very religious. Religious freedom means the freedom to practice your religiousness, if that makes sense. So some people explain it as the freedom to be unfree, because Puritan religion is not exactly. It has a lot of rules, and the more religious you are, the more rules you follow. So, but Americans, some of them are very religious. So, I mean, strict Puritanism is very law and rule oriented. So, no Christmas celebrations, no drinking. Focus on working and praying and reading the Bible while you're awake, and sleep when you're not. These are the main priorities, and the Old Testament over the New Testament, that kind of thing. So this society has, you've got Boston, who is really very not religious now, one of the least religious states, being one of the most religious states in the beginning. So that's going to change up and down over the course of American history, but we've got to focus on the biggest issues because we don't have time. Mainly that the United States starts on the eastern seaboard, has 13 states, and keeps expanding right until after World War II. For hundreds of years, it keeps getting bigger until it finally ends up, incorporating Hawaii as the last state, the 50th state, and that's a neat number. So I doubt they're going to create any new states. There were points at the end of the 19th century where it looked like they might incorporate Cuba, or they might include the Philippines as another state, or Guam, or places like that. But it looks like Puerto Rico is also, these places are called dominions, or they're called protectorates, but they don't have the status of a state. So you've got 50 by the end. Antebellum just means pre-war, and postbellum means after war. These are Roman things. As I told you before, you can see how the Roman culture we talked about, that originally, left its mark so indelibly on the British, continues in at least as strong a way, I would say, with the Americans prioritizing the Republican period of Rome, not rejecting any of its achievements in architecture, philosophy, or law after it in the imperial period, but focusing on the governmental aspects and legal aspects that characterized the Republican period of Rome, whereas the British obviously were emulating the Roman Empire with, the 19th century. We'll talk about that in the next video, and next Friday we'll finish up chapter 6 and go to chapter 7, where the British Empire reaches its height at the end of the 19th century, and Queen Victoria becomes the Empress of India. The title is largely symbolic, but in a sense, many of the Roman emperors were sort of a symbolic thing. The military was the important thing in imperial Rome for much of its existence. But this is obviously similar, that we have a president, but politically speaking, the president is the most important thing, but in reality, the military of the United States is the thing that you can recognize from the beginning to the end, that there's a political side and there's a military side, and sometimes those things intersect, not sometimes, always, almost always. So you got George Washington, the first general. He retires from being the general, and then he becomes the president. It happens many times. Andrew Jackson, Ulysses S. Grant, Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower. These are some of the most accomplished and powerful generals and famous generals who've ever lived. That's 4 of them. There's probably more I'm forgetting, but those 4, they were commanders-in-chief, and then they retire and they become politicians, and they try to keep the military and political things separate. It's really one of the only things that saved the United States Senate from I shouldn't call them Republican, whatever that was, the mob of people that stormed Capitol Hill, was the fact that the military refused to get involved in it. But the American military is very involved in the Civil War. It was a disaster, and sometimes people talk about the American culture sort of careening towards another civil war again, because these days, I think this is a good title. I've never used it, but I think it's a good way to describe the 19th century was just continual conflict between the South and the North. It exploded into a civil war during the 1860s, and it's 1860 to 65, but we'll just say, like usual, just remember it's in the middle, it's the 1860s. Before that, let's talk about westward expansion for a minute, since we have already talked about slavery quite a lot. These states that decide to have slavery are not, there's nothing in the middle, really. You have to, that's part of the problem, it's a us or them mentality. If you have slavery, you've got a lot of slaves, and if you make slavery illegal, you have 0, supposedly. There's other kinds of slavery, I guess. You have to remember that at the end of chapter 4, the type of slavery we're talking about here is racial slavery, and it's chattel slavery. So people are literally in chains, right? And they're being treated violently. That's a different kind of slavery than being forced to work, and being paid. That kind of stuff, being paid very low wages and stuff like that, or debt slavery, like I said, prisoners, their sentences being commuted and then them working for 10 years or something, or 7 years. Those are different kinds of slavery than race-based slavery, which is doesn't treat those people like human beings. It treats them like lesser things. What we talked about that already. The Civil War will be a result of the fact that the United States is getting bigger. Louisiana Purchase happens at the beginning of the century, and then mid-century, in the 1840s, this is a perfect lineup. This is when the Americans win the war against Mexico, the Mexican-American War. They win the war, and they take possession of Texas, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, California. I hope I didn't leave anybody out, but I think there's pieces of states that also get taken from Mexico. But it's a huge territory. Louisiana doubles the size of it, and then the Mexican territory brings in close to over a third. So we're talking about basically America doubling in size twice by the time it gets to the middle of the century. And the states are sort of lining up on one side or the other, and the free states are starting to outnumber the slave states. So in order to protect their society, they're aggressively expansionistic. They want the new territories like California and Texas to be slave states. Otherwise, the balance is going to be in favor of the free states, and they think that their slave society, their entire society is based on this. It's their economy, their social system. It's a caste system, so once you're in slavery, like I said, doesn't matter who you marry, your children inherit the status. You're stuck in there. It's not a class system, it's a caste system. So this is a problem for any idea of freedom. That is probably the number one answer when you say what's the most important thing to Americans. You probably say freedom, and most of the people in the South are not free. So they go to war over it. I went to the wrong side here. Abraham Lincoln, he ends up being the president who represents the free states. You can read the middle of the chapter here to get a sense a little bit about him. I just want to emphasize a few things. He's super tall. He was born in a log cabin in the Midwest. He becomes a lawyer and a representative in Illinois, just like Barack Obama. I think he's not Chicago like Barack, but they started representing the same state. No coincidence there. There's no connection there. It's just a coincidence, is what I mean. Abraham Lincoln becomes the representative political force behind the free states, and Jefferson Davis becomes the president of the states that cede from the Union. A dozen of these states, sort of one at a time and in groups, coalesce into this Confederacy, and the Confederacy fights against the Union. So we'll add that there. What the northern states are called the Union, and I guess I'll put this on the bottom. The Confederacy is the bottom. So they have the two generals. Ulysses S. Grant isn't the overall commander throughout the entire war, but he's the one who finishes it. And he becomes president after the war, and he's a two-term president. Not immediately after the war, because Abraham Lincoln gets assassinated, and then his vice president becomes the president. But Ulysses S. Grant gets elected, and then he's managing the country for 8 years during the Reconstruction era, and he's the supreme commander of the Union. So you know how he treats the people from the South. He treats them like they're traitors, because that's what they were. They were trying to break away from the United States, and that was the argument, is that they couldn't. And so they fought this terrible war. All the casualties added up to being equal to 100 years of wars after that. They didn't, all the wars afterwards didn't add up to the same number of casualties in the Civil War until recently. You can go from every single war, and Appendix 1 in the back of the book shows how many wars the British and Americans have been in. I'm missing some of them there, and there's some typos I noticed as well, but at the back of the book, you can just scan. There's a few pages, and it's several pages of just from 1066 all the way to the present. All the major wars are listed there, and you know, the American state has been at war with somebody or itself, native people, or civil war, or wars overseas like Afghanistan. If you include all these things, there's only a few years that the America the American state has not been at war. We don't necessarily think of it as a war machine all the time, partly because freedom isn't really compatible with war for the most part. Usually you think freedom involves some sort of peaceful state. George Washington said he didn't want to get involved in European politics and stay allied with the French because he didn't want to take a side and get mixed up in all the European wars. And yet here we are with the United States that's always at war somewhere with somebody all the time. Sherman, to which the American tank in World War II was named after, his name was Tecumseh Sherman. Tecumseh Sherman. Tecumseh that's a name he's named after a native chief who was a famous warrior, and his name Sherman sounds pretty much like German. I'm not sure if that's his background, to be honest, but he was very famous for destroying infrastructure in Georgia as he tried to make the Confederacy give up. He does this march to the sea where he just destroys railroads and farms, and his army just eats everything and smashes everything in its path. So you can see pictures of Atlanta, Georgia, and it almost looks like it's been bombed in World War II because his army just goes through and just completely levels the city. He says he's going to make Georgia howl. So anybody who's from Georgia, I know our American student is not, they don't really think too fondly of Tecumseh Sherman. But he also stated that, well, this war is brutal, violent, and murderous. It's like destroying people and killing huge numbers of people. He was also quite racist, had a negative opinion, didn't think African American soldiers were as good. And we all know now that the American, the Black American regiments and divisions who were incorporated in after World War II, segregation in the army stopped. The Korean War was the first war where Americans were not separated by race in the military. So it takes 100 years for them to figure out that African American soldiers are very good, at least as good as anybody else. And when they do that, the units that are all black, a lot of them serve with distinction when they're allowed to do the same sort of specialized, operations or important, defending operations or participate in battles the same way that the units that are white do. But Sherman doesn't do this. He just uses them. If it's a group of black soldiers, he makes them dig ditches or set up defenses or something. He doesn't use them in any important roles, and that just shows you right there what his attitude is. He's not a slave owner, and he doesn't think they should be slaves, but he just doesn't think they're as good or as capable, and that's racist as well. So he's from the North. So you remember what I said. Racism is not something that it was restricted to the South in America. It's pervasive. It's everywhere. The slave issue, though, is where the line gets drawn. It's like you can still be racist and not put somebody in chains and treat them like they're not human. But there's this thing called white supremacy that starts to get traction after the war, after Abraham Lincoln has freed them. It's partly due to the fact that Charles Darwin comes up with this theory of evolution, and European people are looking for reasons why they're better than other people, and they start to justify it using the theory of evolution, which is non-scientific in every way. But this is still an idea that many of imperialists and racists and American leaders came up with to justify their policies, of restricting where people were allowed to live and what they were allowed to do, like whether they were allowed to get married with people. And eventually this kind of idea will take its, ultimate manifestation is in the Nazi German regime and their attitude towards other people of other races, thinking that they actually need to eliminate all of them, right? Now, luckily for all of us, Abraham Lincoln wins the war. Shortly, the war isn't even really wrapped up yet. Robert E. Lee will have to surrender to Ulysses S. Grant because the South is vastly, it's huge in size, but it's vastly less. It has less manpower, it has less resources, it has less equipment. They fight just as well. They don't fight better. That's a myth. But we won't get into that, all the excuses they make. But they are defeated soundly, completely, and they have to surrender unconditionally to Ulysses S. Grant in a farmhouse. That as soon as that happens, and Abraham Lincoln is assassinated watching a play by John Wilkes Booth, a crazy Shakespeare actor. I think I mentioned I'm a Shakespeare professor. That's what I originally focused on when I came out of my undergrad. Now I'm trying to finish my PhD on it. Ironically, he's a Shakespeare actor, and he had a sense of himself as some sort of grand tragic character, and he thought that the United States, he thought, like many people in the South, that Abraham Lincoln was one of the problems. That if they got rid of him, then the South might be able to keep its slave. But he was just a very intelligent, tall representative of the majority of the population. Not the majority of the people in the areas, but more majority of the population. So you go into this era, which is, the South is destroyed. Sherman destroys half of it. The Reconstruction era is trying to fix the South. It doesn't really go very well. And the North gets tired of having its army in the South watching everything. So they pull them back. About a decade later, everybody is, okay, it's the 1870s now. The war is over. We're sick of it. Leave the South alone. They're supposed to do what they're told, but we're not going to occupy the South militarily anymore. As soon as that happens, the legacy of the Confederacy and the slave states reasserts itself, and they start intimidating Black people and threatening them and taking away their rights politically and socially, so that everything gets rolled back to a point close to what it was like. Not visibly the same as slavery, because they're not in masters' houses and they don't have absolute power like that, but living in the South is barely tolerable. The slaves are free now, so they're free men, but they don't have any property. And they're not being paid well, or even the same as other people. They get paid less. So a lot of them leave. Huge migrations of people from the South that go, and this creates the neighborhoods, the Black neighborhoods in New York, in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, in Chicago. They're huge populations now. Most of those people moved there in the late 19th century. Later too, though, segregation continued for almost 100, well, it did continue for 100 years. It's the mid-1960s that the Civil Rights Movement successfully starts to get rid of all those policies, Jim Crow policies, we call them, that they impose on the people in America, in the Deep South, and those things become illegal. Lyndon Johnson, who serves after John F. Kennedy is assassinated in the 1960s, signs that into law, and that's the very big moments that we're going to talk about in Chapter 7. So the Gilded Age gilded just means covered in gold, but gilded is not real gold. It's not solid gold. It's just something metal covered in gold. So if you just scratch it a little bit, then you take the gold off, and underneath you find it's not gold. So the Gilded Age means that America looked like it was doing fantastic, but it was really like this skin deep. So you have all of these super rich people like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller and Stanford, for which the university is named, and Duke, for which the other university on the North Carolina coast is called, in Charlotte. These people, they end up being great philanthropists, but while they're in their prime, they are these hugely, fantastically rich people. And like I said, people in the South are whether they're black or white, the whole society their economy has been shattered. Their infrastructure has been destroyed and set on fire. Lots of their workers are leaving because they don't want to work for barely scraping by when they can work in a factory in the north and still experience, some negative aspects of American society, but they have a chance to give if they work hard, the next generation, each generation is supposed to have a better chance of improving themselves. And in the South, it's very, very difficult, and the North provides a better environment for most of the African Americans to try and succeed in what we call the American dream. Try to improve their situation, their education, get some property and have a successful life that they can enjoy. Where in the South, it's a very, very difficult thing to accomplish. Okay, so that's pretty much how the 19th century shape looks. It's going to be, for the next part of the class, when we do this 20th century, the Americans love to categorize things and analyze things. So the 20th century, when the United States starts to really resemble the country we know now, this kind of shaping of the century, which they self-labeled the American century. It's going to be even more sort of divided. So just remember the big words. The San Francisco 49ers, I forgot about there. Let me rewind for a second. The Wild West is a semi-mythological period. There's a lot of movies about it that distort it. They're mostly from Hollywood. The original cowboys were actually native people. So cowboys versus Indians really is another contradiction there, my friends. There was black cowboys too, and like that was a joke in some movies like Blazing Saddles. But there was lots of people who were cowboys are not white Texans with revolvers that save beautiful Southern belles that are hiding in the bar while they fight high noon sort of gunfights in the middle of the desert. That's all kind of created by Hollywood just to make the cowboy spaghetti western more romantic, I guess is a good way to describe it. The San Francisco 49ers were real though, and in the center of the chapter here you'll see, let me just find the page. There's a picture of a cowboy riding on some cows and with a lasso in a covered wagon. Everybody starts going west. Part of the reason is the gold rush. They find gold in various places, but the most famous one is the one in California. My favorite, because of the team that I watched in the 1980s and 1990s, is called the 49ers, the San Francisco 49ers. 1849 is when they discovered gold, and people lost their minds and quit their jobs, and people in New York of all different backgrounds and classes and wealth tried to go to find gold in the rivers and eventually in the mountains and dig for stuff. But it was originally just trying to pan for gold. At first you could just find in a riverbed you could just find a big chunk of gold, and that's what they were hoping for, because some people did just grab a chunk of gold off the ground because it had come out of the ground thousands of years ago. The water pushed out the gold, and then it was sitting in the bottom of the river. This expansion would, in 1865, right at the end of the war, become it would be Alaska, and that's, I told you, 1867 is when Canada becomes a country, largely in response to the fact that the United States buys Alaska from Russia. So you've got the three big land purchases or acquisitions, not purchases, two purchases and one acquisition by war. Louisiana territory from Napoleon, and then mid-century you have this huge territory that gets added in the 1840s when they defeat Mexico and take northern Mexico away from them. And then in the the end of the 1860s, Alaska gets added. So you got, another sort of progression through the century of America just getting bigger and bigger and geographically wider and wider. It starts expanding up to the edge of Canada, which Vancouver would sort of be there, and Seattle is the American, its American opposite in Washington State, and that's where America and Canada would settle on that line, going straight across from Vancouver all the way across to what we call the Great Lakes. Finally, the final thing to mention is in the book also, there's Paul Bunyan. Unlike Davy Crockett, he's not a real person. It was a myth. It was a story that was told about this guy who was born on the East Coast, and he grew into a giant, so he couldn't stay at home because he was literally flattening buildings when he tripped on his shoelaces. He ends up becoming a lumberjack and a frontiersman, and cuts down trees, 10 trees with one swing. He's a literal giant, like 10 meters, 20 meters tall, or if you're using what one of my favorite professors calls freedom units, feet, he's like 60 feet tall. For anybody who's using freedom units, that is called a tall tale. Davy Crockett's story is, most of it's true. But he didn't wrestle grizzly bears and stuff like that. So a tall tale is an exaggerated tale. So we have King Arthur and we have Robin Hood as these stories, partly based on maybe some information about real people. But Paul Bunyan is just like King Arthur, probably just a completely made up story. And similarly, Robin Hood might be based, it's a long time ago, but Davy Crockett, there actually was a guy named Davy Crockett. It's just his exploits started to become exaggerated by the time they were making movies about him. When I was young, he was almost like a superhero in the forest. Okay, so that's it. That's the wrap. I hope that explains everything that we missed in between the beginning and the end of chapter 5. So remember, imperialism at the beginning of chapter 6 is also included on the quiz, and I will see you on Friday. Have a good week.